Thank you, James, and thank you, Jim Hackett. I think, as you could see, our panelists are a wonderful selection of skills here that Mr. Wright kind of embodied in one person, but obviously had many people that worked with him, but it seems like he was able to connect all of these issues. So I think what I'd like to start with today actually is ask each specialist on the panel to reflect on what they saw in the house and talk about one of the principles, one of Mr. Wright's principles that you saw flashing across the screens. That was one of Wright's 10 principles that defined his work life and is sort of defining our work lives and designers' work lives still, and reflect on one of them and explain to us why that was such an important thing for you personally to have experienced. So why don't we go from the outside in? Because it's Wright is from the inside out, but I'd like to do our traditional, our current idea of what architecture is, which is a very fragmented idea to me. It's all, everybody's doing a lot of things and a lot of non-collaboration happens at the moment. So let's talk about from the outside in. So let's start with Michael. And in terms of the landscape, in terms of the house's place in the community, what was the principle that the house defined for you?
Well, as I've said to a few people on the panel, when I graduated from college, I had this fellowship to go look at all the work of Dan Kiley that had been built, the landscape architect Dan Kiley. But my architectural history professor had been a scholar of Wright and was telling me, even as a young landscape architect, about this dissolve between inside and outside that so characterized the work of Wright. And I think that it's certainly extraordinary to see in his house that we've been in today, but I think it also talks a great deal about the change of relationship between architects and landscape architects that has unfolded, especially in my lifetime, where I think it's fair to say that when I started out, most landscape architects were the caboose on the train. And what's interesting about Wright and some of what he says in what we just saw, but also in his practice, was very early this strong collaboration with Jens Jensen and such an emphasis on the context of his projects. And it's also really interesting to see Taliesin and the degree to which the buildings are so attached to the site, and he has redrawn the indigenous landscape right up to and engaged that in the buildings. And I think it's a stylistic and a spatial difference, but I also think more significantly in our practice, we see a very different way of working with architects, and it's something that started a little bit with Wright, certainly, and especially in the ideas he had, where there's a kind of, it's not just that space moves in and out, but the way that an architect and a landscape architect work together, they're not so much the same or singular at all, but joined in their significance. So this was I don't know if that's a good jumping
That
place.
was a really good jumping point, and also the fact that it still doesn't occur really often and really well. This seamless collaboration between architects and landscape architects. So maybe in your life it does, but a lot of our landscape architects are whining how they're subservient. But anyway, that's another story. I think what I'd like to do now, while we're on the outside, is I would like to bring Bob Adams in here, because you have heard fleetingly that he's a farmer and he's a techie, but he's also incredibly involved in the natural processes. And so you're, because he raises sheep and chicken and grapes and all of these things and works the land, and he designs experiences for IDEO, and he does all of this design stuff, but he's sobered every time he goes out to that farm of his and works on it. So Bob, can you kind of carry on the next step of this relationship of place to building and exterior to the house or to the building a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, building a bit, I think, on what Michael was saying. You know, we were having a conversation this morning about this integration of in and out, and Wright's aspiration to connect the people who lived in his homes to nature. And in fact, it seems that he really saw nature as a tonic of sorts to the materialism and other sort of ills of society that he was observing even at that time 100 years ago. But I think it's interesting to note, you know, how much things have changed in the last 100 years. And it's hard for us to remember that 100 years ago, nature was something that people had spent centuries trying to conquer and get away from. So the idea that an architect would try to sort of reopen this relationship was quite radical. And being sort of, you know, refreshing myself around Wright's philosophy as a precursor to this event, and his kind of aspiration to create this connectivity made me really aware of the limits of his time. And whereas he had aspirations for a very systemic way of thinking about life in the context of the greater world and the role of the dwelling in that context, he was kind of working in a time when those ideas were extremely new, and I think his vision was in fact limited by the time. And what I keep thinking about is if he had sort of continued through the last 100 years, right, and he were sitting with us here today, how would he have expanded those principles that were embodied in his work to take into account the things that we have learned and that we now know as a result of the last 100 years. And, you know, I think about my grandparents who were born in 1908 and the changes that they saw in their lifetimes, you know, literally from the horse and buggy on through all the things that happened in this century and how they were able to kind of adapt with those changes, which probably are unprecedented in terms of their rapidity in the development of you know, human society. So it really made me think about that and how his vision of this sort of systematic and unified approach to design and architecture in the context of our life and society, how that might have broadened to take into account these things that we now know about the state of our planet and our society upon it, and so on and so forth. And the opportunities that are available to us as a culture and society for sort of carving out what the future is going to look like.
So it's really interesting because I think throughout this hour or so that we have together, I think we need to be asking all the time, what would Wright have done had he known some of the things that we know, because he was so on target with what we need to think about now. But as you identify it, the world obviously we all know is very different. And at the same time, it's very much the same because human nature remains human nature, and nature remains nature for whatever purposes. But technology changes and culture changes and all of that. So I think let's keep returning to that because I think that's what sort of helps the trajectory for the future. But I think I'd like to go to the architecture now